we're done. Thank you all for coming. So the topic for the talk today is how should we feel about death? And so I want to start by clarifying what I mean by this question. So the question that I'm asking is, what attitudes is it appropriate or fitting to have concerning your death? Right? So to make this clearer, let me distinguish it from other questions that we might ask. So you might be wondering, what attitude towards death would make you best off? Right? So you might be wondering, if I want to be happiest, how should I think about death? And maybe in that case, you shouldn't think about death very much. Or maybe you should be serene about your death, or maybe you should think about it sometimes so that you're able to prepare for your inevitable death, right? But I'm not so interested in that question. I'm not sure. I don't know what would make you happy. Probably some people would be made happier by one thing, and other people would be made happier by thinking a different way about death. That's not what I'm after, right? It might make you better off to feel a certain way about death, even though it's totally inappropriate to feel that way, that even though your attitude it doesn't fit with its object. Another question that I'm not interested in is, what attitudes would be blameworthy or praiseworthy to have concerning death? Right? So it might be that it's very difficult or impossible to control your attitudes concerning death. Maybe you can't help but be afraid of death, right? And if that's the case, then maybe you can't be blamed for whatever attitude you have concerning your death, right? You'd be like this person, if the doctor hits you on the knee with the hammer, and if you don't kick, right, the doctor wouldn't blame you and say, "You stupid kid, why didn't you kick when I hit you with the hammer?" Right? There's nothing that you could do about it. Or if you did kick, right, either you do or you don't. It's a reflex. So maybe attitudes toward death are in some way like that, in which case it wouldn't be appropriate to blame anyone for being afraid of death. Maybe evolution has made us such that we can't help but be afraid of death. That's fine. That might mean, though, that evolution has made us have inappropriate attitudes towards death, right? So the question I'm interested in is, what is it rational or fitting to feel about your death, right? Okay, so that's the question. Now I want to talk about a couple of assumptions that I'm going to make about death. First assumption I want to make is that there's no afterlife, right? So suppose there is an afterlife, right? Then you might think, well, some people will think the afterlife is really good, and some people will think the afterlife is really bad, and other people will think that in the next life you will come back as a butterfly, right? There are many possible things that could happen, but in this case, how you should feel about death would depend on what kind of an afterlife you're going to have. Right? And so the answer to how you should feel about your death is just going to be, well, if it would be a good afterlife, then you should be happy that you're going to die. And if it's going to be a terrible afterlife, then you should be unhappy that you're going to die. And there's not that much else, not that interesting philosophically to think about. Right? It can be interesting to think about afterlives, but I'm going to assume there's no afterlife because there are interesting questions that arise on the assumption that when you die, you go out of existence. Right? So I'm going to suppose that at the moment of death and from then onwards, you no longer exist. The second assumption I want to make is that life is generally worth living. So obviously not everyone feels this way. If you're a pessimist, you might think that most human lives are not worth living. David Benatar has recently written a book called Better Never to Have Been, in which he argues that, for example, life is full of little miseries. Maybe you're sitting here listening to a boring talk, and it's kind of uncomfortable. Maybe you're a little bit hungry. You're not going to be able to eat for a couple hours, so you're frustrated. And most of life is like that, he thinks. And if that's the way life is, then we'd have one way of thinking about death. But I'm going to assume that that's not generally the way that life is generally good for us on balance, which is not to say that it always is, but in general it's good for us. Okay. So here's a simple argument for a view about how we should feel about death. So first of all, the first premise of the argument is death is bad for the person who dies. Now, this premise is questioned by people like Epicurus, for example, right? So Epicurus, maybe some of you have read Epicurus. Epicurus thought that death is nothing to us, right? Because according to Epicurus, Epicurus agrees with the assumption that death is the end of you, there's no afterlife, right? And he says, well, while you're alive, you haven't died yet, so death isn't bad for you yet. And then after you die, you no longer exist, so death can't be bad for you at a time when you don't exist. So there's no time at which death can harm you, and so he says that death is not ever bad for you. You shouldn't ever feel bad about death. Right? Most people think that Epicurus is making a mistake, right? And the way in which Epicurus is making a mistake is that he's ignoring the obvious way in which death is bad for you, despite the fact that you don't exist anymore, because of the fact that you don't exist anymore. And that is that death deprives you of having more of a good life. Right? So we're assuming that having more of a good life, we're supposing that life is generally worth living, so that if you got more life, that would be on the whole good for you, right? And so being deprived of something that's on the whole good for you is a bad thing for you. Right? And so death deprives you of a lot, especially if you die very prematurely. It deprives you of all the future goods that you would have gotten in life. So according to the deprivation account of the badness of death, death is bad because in virtue of the fact that it deprives you of having more of a good life. So to figure out how bad death is for you on the deprivation account, what we do is we look at what would have happened had you not died when you did. So if you would have had a long and happy life, then your death is bad for you. Right? Sometimes someone would have had a short and not very happy life if they hadn't died. These are cases when we think that maybe euthanasia makes sense, right? And in these cases, death isn't bad for you. But in general, death is bad for you. The second premise says, when something's bad for you, a negative attitude is appropriate to have towards it, right? This maybe seems obvious. Some people would think that this is kind of a matter of definition, that that's just what it is for something to be bad, is for it to be appropriate to have a negative attitude towards it. But we don't need to settle that question. But it seems plausible, right, that a negative attitude is appropriate or fitting towards something that's bad for you. And so therefore a negative attitude is fitting to have towards your death. So there's a very simple argument. Okay? And I think it's a pretty good argument, but I'm going to now raise some problems for it. There are two problems that I'm going to raise for this argument. So the first problem is to figure out which negative attitude you should have towards your death, because there are many negative attitudes and negative emotions that you can have, right? So here are a bunch of things. So excited is not a negative emotion. I'm just going to cross out all the things that aren't emotions. Shy is not negative. Being tired is not even an emotion or an attitude at all. Being sick is not an emotion. So we'll just get rid of that. But that still leaves quite a few possibilities, right? So if your death is bad for you, maybe you should dislike it. Maybe you should be sad about it. Maybe you should be afraid of death. Maybe you should be angry or worried. There are other ones that aren't up here, like dread. Maybe you should dread your death, right? And there are interesting questions about what makes an emotion appropriate to have towards a certain kind of object, right? So some people have argued that fear is appropriate to have towards something only if it's uncertain whether that thing's going to happen. Right? So if before an election, if there's a candidate you don't want to win, you might say, well, I'm afraid this candidate is going to win. That makes sense. But after the election, once you found out who won, it would be strange to say, I'm afraid that this candidate won. That it would be kind of inappropriate to have fear about something when you know that it already happened. Right? I'm not quite sure that that's really right. I don't really want to focus so much on this question, although I'm going to come back to it later on at the end of the talk. So I'm not sure which negative attitude would be most appropriate to have. Maybe any of these attitudes could be appropriate to have towards death. It seems to me, I'm skeptical about the claim about fear, partly because it would be strange to say, okay, I'm not sure whether I'm going to die, so I'm afraid of death, but now I know I'm going to die tomorrow, and so now I can't be afraid of it anymore. That seems strange. If I knew I was going to die tomorrow, I think I would be afraid, and it seems appropriate. The problem that I want to focus on is a problem that arises because of the fact that the deprivation account uses counterfactuals in explaining what makes death bad for you, right? So remember, according to the deprivation account, death is bad for you if you would have had a good life had you continued to live, right? So suppose that this guy, Jim, steps in front of a bus and is killed. Right? Now, there are two things that we might say, there are many things we might say, but here are two things that we might say about the situation, right? One thing you might say is, he got hit by the bus and died. This is really bad for him because he would have lived a long life otherwise, right? Another thing we might say is, given that he got hit by the bus, it's not so bad for him that he died. Right? Because if he got hit by the bus and didn't die, then he would have been horribly injured and in horrible pain and not had a very good life after that, right? So both of these things are true, or they seem true, right? Both these things are appropriate to say about the very same thing that happened, right? And so what this shows, as many people have noticed, there's been a lot of literature in the philosophy of language about counterfactuals over the last 40 or so years, where people have pointed out that whether a counterfactual statement is true or acceptable depends on what kinds of things we hold fixed, right? So when we say it's bad for Jim to have got hit by the bus, when we say it's bad for Jim to have died, we're not holding fixed that he was hit by the bus, right? We're imagining that if he hadn't died, he wouldn't have been hit by the bus at all. Right? When we say that, when we explicitly say, given that he got hit by the bus, right, then we are holding that fixed. And whether we hold fixed that he got hit by the bus or not makes a difference to whether we also say that his death was bad for him, right? So this is puzzling in a way, right? Because now, what do we say? How do we apply the deprivation account to the question of whether death is bad for you? So here's what I think the best thing is to say about that. That the badness of death is contrastive. So let me explain what I mean by that. When we say that death is bad, what we really mean is death rather than some other thing that we might be thinking of is bad, that would have happened, that we're supposing, given the context and given what we're holding fixed, would have happened, right? So death rather than this one thing is bad, and death rather than this other thing is not bad. And this seems like the right thing to say about the example, right? So for Jim, death rather than getting hit by the bus and being injured is not bad. Death rather than not getting hit by a bus at all is bad, right? Now this explains how we can truly say both of the things that we wanted to say that seemed incompatible, right? They're not really incompatible because the badness of death has this other component to it. It's a contrastive component. There's a comparison that we're making, that we're employing when we say that death is bad. So this is another way of saying, when you say death rather than not being hit by a bus is bad, or we say death rather than being hit by a bus and injured is not bad, what we're saying is, all that really means, this is kind of a complicated way of saying death is worse than not being hit by a bus, and death is not worse than being horribly injured, right? That would be a simpler way of saying this. For a long time I thought this is fine. This is all we can say about the badness of death, and that's all we really need to say. And so John Broome, who's an economist and philosopher at Oxford, agrees about this, and he says all the significant facts about death have been fully stated once we said what dying at 82 is better than and what it is worse than. There's no further significant question whether or not dying at 82 is an absolutely bad thing. Right? So the point here is that there's not one comparison that is the right comparison to make. Right? Death is worse than some things, is better than some things, and sometimes it's appropriate to make one comparison, and other times it's appropriate to make a different comparison. Right? Now I think he's overstating things a little bit, because what he's left out here is what would have happened. Right? But as it turns out, since what I've been trying to show is what would have happened, what we can truly say would have happened, depends on what we're thinking about, what we're holding fixed. So suppose that this is right. Suppose you agree. Now, and you might want to argue with me about whether the badness of death is contrastive in this way, and that's fine. But suppose that that's right. Suppose Broome is right to say that the badness of death is contrastive. Then the tricky thing is that it's hard to see how fear could be appropriate to have towards death, because fear isn't contrastive, it doesn't seem to me. Right? So when you fear death, it's not that you fear death rather than living a long life, or fear death rather than something else. You just fear death. Right? So it seems like the only attitude that could be appropriate to have towards death would be some contrastive attitude. And an obvious example of a contrastive attitude would be preference. So when you have a preference, you prefer that this thing happen rather than that thing, right? You don't just prefer this thing. Preference is a contrastive attitude, right? It always requires two things and a comparison between them. And so it would make sense that if the value of death is contrastive, and if we're looking for an attitude that's going to be appropriate to have towards that kind of value, that it should be a contrastive value, and so preference might be, a contrastive attitude, and so preference seems like a good candidate for a contrastive attitude. So now we need to know what makes a preference appropriate or correct, but this seems kind of easy, right? So when is it appropriate to prefer one thing to another thing? When it's better. Right? When is it inappropriate to prefer one thing to another? When it's worse. Right? So to have correct preferences is to always prefer what's better to what's worse. Right? And so what we'd say about the example that I gave is that Jim, in contemplating various futures, right, would have appropriate attitudes if he prefers having a long and healthy life to dying, and if he doesn't prefer dying to having a short and terrible life. Right? That would be an appropriate set of preferences for him to have. So that much seems right, but now we're left with this problem that it doesn't seem like fear is appropriate. Right? So how could it be that fear is not appropriate to have towards death? How could it be that dreading death is not appropriate? Right? So I just want to give a couple examples to show why I don't think preference is all that we need here, right? So part of the problem is that preference, you can prefer one thing to another, even though both things are really bad, right? So maybe losing one arm is preferable to losing two arms, right? But both of them are really bad things. You don't want either of those things to happen, right? But you still have a preference. You prefer losing one arm to losing two arms, right? And on the other hand, you might prefer having 2 scoops of ice cream to having 1 scoop of ice cream, right? But you like both of those things. They're both really good, but one is better. So you'd have appropriate preferences if you prefer losing 1 arm to 2 arms, right? And you have appropriate preferences if you prefer 2 scoops of ice cream to 1 scoop of ice cream. But that isn't all we want, because there's still something inappropriate if you say, well, I prefer losing 1 arm to losing 2 arms, but they're both great. I'd really like to lose any arms. There's still something inappropriate, even though your preferences are appropriate. And the same with ice cream. There'd be something wrong with you if you thought maybe there'd be something wrong. If you, assuming that ice cream is good for you, right? If you prefer having 2 scoops of ice cream to 1, but you really don't want to have either, right? So we want to say you got to have more than just an appropriate set of preferences. You've also got to have appropriate non-contrastive attitudes towards these things, right? And so the problem that I'm trying to solve here is, how can we say that having any non-contrastive attitude towards death would be appropriate? And part of the problem here is, so there's something that you might try to do here, which is to say, here's why it's inappropriate to have a positive attitude towards both losing 1 arm or losing 2 arms, right? It's because both of those are worse than another alternative which you're neutral about, right? So if we can locate a neutral state, then we might be able to say that certain attitudes are inappropriate because they reflect an inappropriate preference structure, right? The problem is that in the case of death, remember, we're assuming that there's no afterlife. Starting at the moment of death, you don't exist. And so nothing good or bad is happening to you from the moment that you die, right? Given our assumptions. So it seems like in itself, the appropriate attitude to have towards non-existence would be a neutral attitude. Be completely serene about your non-existence. There's nothing bad about it for you in itself, right? The only way it gets to be bad is in comparison with other things, right? So if you were to describe your whole preference structure, the state of being dead should be about the same for you in itself as the state of being asleep, and you shouldn't be afraid of being asleep. You shouldn't have any negative attitude towards that, to having a dreamless sleep, right? So I don't think we're going to be able to get everything that we want just by looking at what's an appropriate preference structure to have, right? Okay. Sorry if that was complicated. We can come back to that later if you want. But so what I'm trying to do is to try to figure out. What are some things that we could do here? So one option would be we could deny that it is ever rational to fear death. Right? We could say, okay, all you got to do is, this is the best we can do. We can say you have to have this preference structure, but having fear towards death is inappropriate. You can only fear things that are bad in themselves, and being dead isn't bad in itself, and death isn't bad in itself. So it's not rational to fear death, because fear is a non-contrastive attitude. But this seems like a last resort for us, right? This is just to give up and say Epicurus was right? And it's going to be difficult to agree that it's inappropriate to be afraid or dread death. So we should try harder than that. Another thought is to say that I was wrong to say that fear is not contrastive, right? You might say, fear really is contrastive. You really do fear death rather than something else, right? And you might say, well, it doesn't seem like it because the alternative is usually suppressed or implicit in your fear. So what you really fear is death rather than a long life. But I don't think there's any reason to think that all cases of fearing death have to be like this. And so I don't think this is really a good way to go. But another thing is, there are going to be some cases of fear where just the fact that one thing is worse than another is not going to make it appropriate to have fear towards the thing that's worse, right? So going back to the previous slide, it wouldn't be appropriate to fear getting one ice cream cone rather than two, right? Even if it would be appropriate to fear losing both arms rather than one. And everything is worse than something and worse and better than something. And so in every case, there's going to be some appropriate fear that you could have if this view were true, right? So I'm not really happy with this option. Another thing you could do is to reject what I said about the contrastive value of death, right? You could say, no, that was wrong. We can come up with a good theory of counterfactuals that explains how one of those judgments was false. Maybe it was wrong to say that Jim's being hit by the bus was not bad for him, even given that he got hit by the bus. But that just seems wrong to that case. So I'm partly here just relying on the fact that for 40 years or more, philosophers of language have assumed that and have tried to account for the fact that the truth values of counterfactuals are sensitive to context. Right? If they're wrong about that, that's great. Then the job becomes much easier. We don't have to do everything in terms of preferences, right? We can go back to our simple argument. But I'm assuming that they're right. So if they're right, if the philosophers of language are right, then what I think we should try to do is to explain the rationality or the correctness of attitudes like fear in terms of preference, by using what we've already determined about what makes preferences correct. So this is an idea that I'm floating that I'm not entirely happy with, but it's the best thing that I've been able to come up with so far. So here's how this is supposed to work. So I'm going to give an analogy first. Okay, so beliefs are usually non-contrastive, right? So I believe that there's a microphone on the table, right? I don't believe that there's a microphone rather than an elephant on the table. Maybe I believe that too, but I don't have to believe such a thing in order to believe there's a microphone on the table. Right? Sometimes beliefs can be correct or incorrect, right? So if what I believe is true, then my belief is correct. If what I believe is false, my belief is incorrect, right? It seems to me that sometimes when you have an incorrect belief, that can render some emotion of yours incorrect, right? That the incorrectness of a belief can sometimes infect other attitudes that you have and feelings that you have and make them inappropriate. So here's an example. So suppose you're reading the newspaper, there's a headline that says, scientists find that eggs cause heart attacks. And you read this and you believe it, so you come to have the belief that eggs are unhealthy. And this causes you to be averse to eggs. It causes you to dislike eggs, right? If somebody says, do you want an egg? You say, no, I don't want eggs, right? And it's because you have this belief about eggs that they would give you a heart attack. But then, suppose it turns out that in another part of the newspaper, it actually said scientists find eggs prevent heart attacks, right? And you didn't read that part, right? So you have this belief that eggs are unhealthy, and it's a false belief. It seems to me that false belief renders your aversion to eggs irrational or inappropriate. When you have a false belief that's making you have an attitude, that attitude is rendered inappropriate by the inappropriateness of the belief. That's not to say that it might not be justified, right? So you might be justified in thinking that eggs cause heart attacks because you read it and your testimony gives you evidence, right? But you would still be false. It would still be a false belief, even if it's justified. And so your aversion to eggs might, in the same way, be still justified, but inappropriate. Right? You shouldn't have that belief, that aversion, because it's based on a false belief. So here's what I want to say about preference, is that maybe preference could work in the same way. So I just gave a story that explains when a preference is correct or incorrect, right? So suppose that preferences could also affect your beliefs, and suppose that the incorrectness of a preference could infect an attitude that you have, right, and render it incorrect. It seems like that could happen too. So if you prefer one kind of life to another kind of life, and your preference is incorrect, and that preference makes you have an attitude like fear or like desire towards a certain kind of life, then your fear or your desire would be incorrect. Right? So this is the idea. And the thought is that it can't just be that having any old incorrect belief or any old incorrect preference could make some attitude incorrect. The belief or the preference would have to be in some way controlling your having the attitude in order for its correctness to affect the correctness of your attitude, right? That's the idea. So the thought is that if you stopped having that, if your attitude is such that if you stopped having the belief, you would no longer have the attitude. Like if you stopped believing that eggs were unhealthy, you'd stop being averse to eggs. Then your aversion to eggs is controlled by or regulated by the belief. Right? And I want to say, maybe it's the same thing with preferences. And if that's the case, then we could say that if you have a fear of death that is controlled by a preference for continued life over death that is inappropriate, then your attitude would be incorrect. But if it's controlled by a preference that is correct, then if everything else goes right, then it would be appropriate. So if you prefer a long, happy life to dying, and that's correct for you to have that preference, and that's what's making you afraid of death, then your fear of death would be appropriate and correct and fitting, right? So that's the basic idea. Now let me talk about a couple problems for this idea that make me unsure whether we should accept it. So first of all, this is kind of an abstract consideration about mental states, right? But it seems to me that despite the fact that economists, for example, have taken preferences to be this really important thing in understanding rationality, right? I'm skeptical, and I think that preferences are not really fundamental mental states. I think they're not primary. I think that what happens is you like one thing more than another thing, and as a result of that, we can say that you prefer it, right? Your preferring it depends on your having these other likes and dislikes, right? Not the other way around. So preferences are kind of floating on top of the other mental states that you have, like likes and dislikes and desires and aversions. I think those are the basic things. And to say that you have a preference is to say that your other likes and dislikes are arranged in a certain way. Right? I'm not going to try to argue for that. That's just kind of the way it seems to me. Preference seems like a more superfluous thing. And if that's the case, that would be a big problem for my view, right? Because now to say that somebody, if to say that somebody prefers this to this is just to say that they like this to a certain degree and they like this to a lesser degree, right? Then it's going to be hard to see how we're back to square one in trying to say what would make those likes and dislikes appropriate or not, right? Because what I'm trying to do is to explain the likes and dislikes and the fears and the aversions in terms of preference, right? And if preference is not fundamental, then that could be a problem. So that's one concern that I have about the view. There are also other kinds of cases that we should think about that the view that I just stated is not going to help us with very much. So imagine that somebody thinks about their death, and they think about the fact that if they lived a long and healthy life, that would be really good for them, and so they prefer to have a long and healthy life rather than to die. Right? And furthermore, this causes them to always be afraid of death. So they wake up in the morning thinking, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. And they just do that all day. Right? That's their attitude. There's something wrong with that person too. There's something inappropriate with that person's attitudes as well. But the attitude is controlled by a correct preference for having a long and happy life rather than to die, right? So you'd have to say something more about what makes attitudes appropriate to explain why this person's attitudes would be inappropriate. So one thought would be that this isn't really an objection to the view that I stated. You might think that what's really going on is just that when you sit around thinking, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, all the time, and you're obsessed with the badness of your death, this is causing you to have inappropriate attitudes towards other things that are good or bad, right? So it would, for example, make you not be able to appreciate the good things in your life and thereby have inappropriate attitudes towards those good things in your life, right? And so even though the attitude itself towards death isn't inappropriate directly, it's indirectly inappropriate because it's preventing you from having overall appropriate attitudes towards the good and bad things in your life, right? I think that's a pretty plausible thing you could say about this case. On the other hand, there could be somebody who desires to die because they're focused on the fact that dying would be better for them than being tortured forever, right? Even though they weren't in any danger of being tortured forever. They're just thinking about this fact, and they realize they have this preference for dying rather than being tortured forever, and that makes them want to die. Now, there's something inappropriate there, too, right? But again, the preference is correct. It is correct to have a preference to die rather than be tortured for a long time. Right? So the fact that the attitude is based on that preference can't explain why the attitude is incorrect, right? So there you'd have to give some other story. So maybe you could say that there are certain things that's just inappropriate to think about, right? So making this comparison between death and being tortured is inappropriate in a circumstance where you're in no danger of being tortured, right? So it's inappropriate to have that preference at all. Even though it's a correct preference, it's inappropriate for that preference to influence your other attitudes, right? So maybe the view is not in such bad shape with respect to those kinds of cases. But I suspect there are a lot of other cases that might still pose a problem for the view. But it's still the best that I was able to do. So for the last thing I want to do is talk about, go back to the first problem that I mentioned. The problem was to determine which attitudes are appropriate to have, which negative attitudes are appropriate to have towards your death. Supposing that some negative attitude is appropriate to have concerning your death, which one? So maybe you should have existential terror, like Homer in the painting, right? Or maybe you should be disappointed, like Michaela was disappointed when she didn't get the gold medal, right? These are very different attitudes, right? And so one question is, consider existential terror, right? So this is a kind of feeling that you might have when you think about the fact that you won't exist in 100 years. You think about the universe going on without you, and you'll never be in it again, and you won't be conscious anymore, and there'll just be no you. And many people are really terrified by this, right? And terrified to a degree that's not, it doesn't seem proportional to the amount of good things that they're deprived of by death, right? So even someone who's older, maybe doesn't have very much more good stuff to look forward to, could still have existential terror about their death, and it couldn't be such an extreme negative attitude wouldn't be appropriate to have towards just some deprivations of good things. So, if you're deprived of getting to go to a tennis match, say, you wouldn't be terrified of not getting to go to the tennis match. You might be disappointed or sad that you didn't get to go, but if you were terrified, there would be something very strange about that, right? And death, according to the deprivation account, is kind of like missing out on lots and lots of tennis matches, right? And so how could it be that missing out on lots and lots of tennis matches now makes it the case that it's appropriate to be terrified instead of just sad or disappointed, right? So how can we justify existential terror? And another question is, it seems like we're pretty tolerant in our attitudes about death, that if someone feels pretty serene about death, maybe they're a little disappointed, but they're not too worried about it, and another person feels existential terror, we tend to think, well, it's all right, people can feel what they want, right? Who cares? Right? But one of those people must be making a big mistake, right? Because death is either really bad for them or it's not really bad for them. And if it's really bad for you and you're just a little bit disappointed, you're making a big mistake, right? So I guess a lingering question here is, how could different attitudes about death be incorrect? As I tend to think that it's okay to have kind of different attitudes about death, and I wouldn't think that somebody deserved blame, for example, for feeling too scared or not scared enough about death. Again, that's not the question, but still, it doesn't seem like it's inappropriate to have these different attitudes. So a last thought is that about existential terror. So think about what the deprivation account says about the badness of death. The deprivation account explains the badness of death by appealing to your well-being level and what death does to your well-being level. And it makes it the case that your total well-being that you get in life is less than it would have been, right? And it seems like merely being deprived of some well-being might not be the appropriate sort of thing to have existential terror about. So one thought might be to really explain why existential terror would be justified. You have to appeal to a completely different kind of thing. And one thought might be you could explain existential terror in terms of meaninglessness, right? So we evaluate our lives in different ways. So we say that that things are going well for us, but we also say that life is meaningful or not meaningful. And these might be different ways. I mean, this is arguable, but at least arguably, these are completely different ways of evaluating a life. And your life could go really well for you, but be meaningless. Right? Maybe just you have lots of meaningless enjoyments throughout your life, and that's a really good life for you, but it's meaningless. Or life could be meaningful, right? Full of meaningful activities, but not very happy. You might say that this person had a meaningful, but meaningful life, but wasn't well off. So suppose that's the case. You might think that you could use meaninglessness to explain existential terror, and one way to do it might be to say, suppose that you thought that in order for life to be meaningful, your projects would have to be successful in a permanent way, maybe, or that it would have to end well, right? And since life always ends with death, and since the universe eventually will wipe out all of your projects are meaningless on this way of thinking about things. And since your projects were meaningless, your life must have been meaningless. And so if that thought is true, then that's at least one way that you might feel existential terror about death, right? Is by thinking that, once I'm gone, it won't have mattered whether I lived, right? And if that's the case, then maybe to fully explain the correctness of all of our attitudes about death, we have to look at more than just a deprivation account of the badness of death. We also have to look at things like meaninglessness. Anyway, that's what I've got. So thank you. Fala.